Hey everyone, welcome back to a hardware news recap for the week. We've had a good amount of coverage this past week for pre-built, so we covered the power spec system, the Alienware R15, and there's news on that because Alienware has a new R16 that we're going to talk about in this episode. We also covered two coolers recently if you haven't seen those videos yet. But for news, the RX 7800 XT had a leak, so that will start developing the sort of mid-range, the new mid-range for AMD's cards. Intel had an A580 leak, which should be on the more affordable side below the A750, which has been $200 to $250. And then we have a couple of other items as well, like Minisforum making even more tiny PCs, and Lenovo potentially pushing into the handheld market alongside the Ally and the Steam Deck. Before that, this video is brought to you by Fantex and the G300A Mesh Edition case. The Fantex G300A revives the A-series approach to airflow that Fantex began really pushing with the P400A that we liked previously. The new G300A comes in a few variants based on fan count and uses the Fantex ultra-fine front mesh that allows for a higher airflow without double stacking filters, as we've shown in the past. The G300A Eclipse is a compact tower supporting ATX boards, and you can learn more at the link in the description below. Up first, PowerColor accidentally blew the lid off of the AMD RX 7800 XT card. As a reminder, currently for the 7000 series, AMD has the 7900 XTX, the 7900 XT, and then it just recently launched the 7900 GRE. That wasn't a rumor, that's a real card. This leak indicates that the 7900 GRE is not simply a replacement for the 7800 XT. There will, in fact, exist a 7800 XT as well, and it does have different specs. Now, this type of leak, It's basically, it's fact, it's first party, it's just they accidentally published it too early. So this type of leak always makes you wonder how accidental it truly is, if it's a guerrilla marketing type of effort trying to get on the ground and get some people talking before a proper launch, or if actually, in fact, PowerColor just published a page. Which is very believable. On the listing, PowerColor lists the specs for the 7800 XT as having 3840 stream processors, so that would be a 60 CU version of a 7000 series card. It'll have 16 gigabytes of GDDR6, it's running a 256-bit wide bus, and it's supposed to have a quote-unquote game clock of 2255 megahertz for the Red Devil model. Now in terms of CU count, this is really the only indicator we have of performance at the moment. If we pull up the specs for, say, the 7800 XT from AMD's site, it's got 24 CUs more than the 7800 XT. And the 7800 GRE that just launched has 20 CUs more than the 7800 XT as well. These specs put the 7800 XT squarely between the 79 XT and the RX 7600, but PowerColor wasn't kind enough to leak an MSRP, so we can't really speculate on value right now. The price gulf in the middle of the Radeon lineup is massive, but it's nice to see that AMD has decided to give this a full set of 16 PCIe lanes and 16 gigabytes of memory. We don't know the card's TDP, but the Red Devil model they showed has two PCIe 8 pins, and it suggests an 800 watt power supply for the full system. So this is pretty different from the 7900 GRE in the 20 CU count difference, but also if we look at images of the die layout. It's clearly the smaller Navi 32 GPU, and it only has 4 of the chiplet MCDs. Beyond that, there's not too much to talk about with the exact Red Devil model shown. It's equipped with a slimmer version of the same cooler PowerColor uses on high-end GPUs, and it's so similar, in fact, that the straight-on image of the card clearly shows a cooler with 3-slot thickness, so they're reusing that image. But the actual 7800 XT shown on the rest of the page is thinner. In another GPU leak, it looks like more desktop cards are on the way from Intel. So we talked about their laptop models last week, a couple days ago, and now they have the A580 desktop card. This was actually announced a long time ago. So back in September, Intel announced it alongside the rest of the lineup. And now a new Geekbench result, as found by BenchLeaks on Twitter, suggests that it's finally getting close to launch. The result lists the A580 running in a system along with an i7-12700. This is not the same thing as the mobile variants we talked about on the last hardware news, as this desktop A580 will have 24 Xe cores. That's only 4 fewer than the A750, which is already a good value in the GPU market right now. It's also got 8 gigabytes of memory, but it has a reduced graphics clock of 1700 megahertz and 175 watts total power. In terms of Intel's lineup right now, if you haven't looked recently, the A380 is currently their lowest end. It's kind of bordering effectively mobile chip performance, but that's their lowest end. That's $120, and the A750 has been as low as $240. pretty sure they had a sale at like 200 briefly on some of the retailers. So between 240 and 120, there's definitely room for a card in between. $180 mark would be a common point. Of course, 200 would be another one. So if Intel plays its cards right, the A580 could be a very interesting sub $200 option, which the market desperately needs right now. And Intel kind of, it seems to have general goodwill or community sentiment behind what it's trying to do in graphics. So they need to maintain that. And that means not playing the same sort of stack shifting and price increasing game that the other two vendors are playing. Up next, hot on the heels of our full review of the Alienware R15, the next model has been released to market with a totally new outer shell. Alienware says the new R16 features its elevated Legend 3 industrial design. Now, it's of course impressive that they're on the third iteration of the Legend industrial design. Don't really know what that means, but sounds good. They also say that it provides efficient airflow without sacrificing performance. Alienware has a lot of marketing on the page about its, quote, intentional thermal strategy. This implies perhaps that the outgoing models didn't have an intentional thermal strategy, or if they did, it was intentionally bad, which it was. Alienware claims 20% quieter operation, something we talked about last time, and we'll be able to test for that anyway. And it might not be entirely marketing BS because the outside of the R16 looks totally different from the previous model. It has a ventilated top panel, it directly exhausts air from the CPU liquid cooler, and it looks to have a wider intake channel in the front. The ventilated side panel is there as well still, and that was one of the big changes that we saw in the R15 versus R14 that actually did benefit GPU thermals. Alienware also says the new design is up to 40% smaller without sacrificing internal volume, and that only really happens one way. It just goes to show, though, how bloated and unnecessary the old design was with its molded plastic appendages. Now, the only one way you can change the outside but not the inside is to just keep the inside, which they've been doing for a long time now. So typically you would refer to this as keeping the same tooling. So in some cases in the DIY market, same thing. Entire inside remains identical or very close to it with small tweaks, and then they strap sort of the extras on top of that. And looking internally, it really doesn't look much different. It uses the same clip-on spring-retained fan brackets that we've seen in the past, and they're in the same places. It still uses a giant proprietary motherboard with integrated front I/O to guarantee that this is basically at least one part e-waste once a single thing goes wrong. And just to go down this path again for a second, one of the things that Alienware has really, we think, done poorly is, and it's weird too, because Dell has like web pages dedicated to its environmental stewardship and things that it wants to do to benefit the environment. This is an issue, like in habitat preservation, for wildlife, stuff like that. It's something I personally care very much about. Whether or not you care about it, it's not really relevant here, because what actually matters is Dell talks about how much they're trying to reduce waste, and then they go and they make computers that have proprietary motherboards, and they attach all of their front I/O to the board so that if anything ever goes wrong or you simply want to upgrade, you basically either can't use the case or you can't use the board. They have to go together, and that introduces issues with cooler compatibility because on some past models, Alienware has had non-standard mounting for coolers. For example, we called it a structural cooler where they would mount it to the chassis itself. And so the problem with all of these things is, especially because I personally do care about the impact of waste that we create and the impact to the consumer in terms of repairability of a component, a computer, we're gonna hold them to the stuff that they claim they're trying to do. And they're not doing it. So if you replace that motherboard with a normal ATX one, you're gonna have empty I/O at the front. You're gonna have a big hole in the front of the case, might benefit it thermally, but you're gonna have a weird hole there nonetheless, and you'll lose your front I/O. Likewise, if you want to replace the case at some point, maybe you wanna accommodate some new part, like a larger GPU that wasn't accounted for in the original design, then now you have a motherboard that won't fit in a that generation Alienware case, or maybe older ones, but you're not gonna be able to pull it forward into something normal. So these are the problems we've had with this sort of proprietary designs where it relies on specific design of another component when it could just be a standard. Now, it's different when there can't just be a standard. So you're talking handheld gaming devices where everything is different, laptops where everything is different. That's a different story. But when you have existing prevailing standards and you have a chassis that can fit those standards and, in fact, claims to accommodate those standards for other aspects of it, then you just use the standard. Don't cause problems. Anyway, we'll talk about that more later. Rant aside, the current part choice is actually a little strange for Alienware. Normally, they have one super expensive SKU, but this time they have one that has a 12900F and an RTX 4070, and that costs $100 more than a SKU with a 13700F and a 4070 Ti. The highest end GPU you can get in the R16 right now at the time of writing is a 4070 Ti. We assume that's to ensure existing stock of super expensive R15s have a reason to sell still. And maybe they'll introduce a 4090 SKU in the future, but we have bought one of these. I forget which exact model we bought. I think it was the highest end one they sell, which is $2,250 right now. So we want to test that out. We've got it coming in, and we'll be looking at that soon. Now, overall, it looks like Alienware has been starting to come around to some of the problems we've been talking about. The proprietary thing is going to be very hard to enact or encourage any change there because that is from the top of Dell, which owns Alienware. So that likely won't change without really a lot of kicking and screaming. But they do have a few comment replies below their deep dive video for the launch of the R16, and those are at least encouraging. In a reply to commenters, Alienware wrote, quote, "Promise we're listening. Change takes time." They also wrote, "Across every product lifecycle, we try to gather feedback from our community, analysts, experts, journalists, and reviewers to implement for the future. With this new Aurora R16 specifically, we feel we've addressed many pain points communicated. In that respect, we believe everyone can appreciate the advancements and improvements we made here." I really hope we can. I can compartmentalize the complaints, when we look at this and review. So if they've improved the thermals and they've improved acoustics and things like that, but they haven't improved the proprietary nature of the board, which we know they haven't, obviously we can give credit for one and we can continue sort of knocking for the other one until that one improves hopefully one day also. It's just better for everyone. Like being able to, the replaceability of the parts, it saves consumers tons of money, it reduces waste. So that's something we would like to see. But we'll start with the simple stuff, not creating a self-incinerating hellscape of a box like they've been doing. Maybe they've fixed that. We'll see. Up next, more unique Minisforum PCs. In a breath of fresh air, Minisforum has been making a name for itself by the sheer number of models it develops. It feels like every couple weeks they're announcing a new one, and this time there are two to talk about. The first has a discrete Intel A730M on an MXM card. MXM has always been really interesting. It never quite got the foothold that it needed, but it was developed for laptops. If you're not familiar with MXM, it's been around a while. It is in fact a standard. It's not a Minisforum only thing, and it was designed to make modular replaceable GPU cards that effectively socket into a laptop. So like the old PCIe or something. See how many people remember that. The Minisforum HN2673 is similar overall to the NUC enthusiast models from Intel, like Serpent Canyon. It's made to stand up vertically on an integrated stand to allow the heavily ventilated side panels to have as unrestricted airflow as possible. The cooling is actually one of the most interesting aspects here, as Minisforum is using a unique approach with an assembly of 4 fans on one side that blast air through the various heat sinks internally. The exploded view render gives a good look at how it's all arranged. You can see how both the soldered i5-12650H CPU and the MXM A730M both face the cooler. We're not sure if the heat sinks are joined together as a single unit, but it's still interesting. This HN2673 starts at $650 for the version with 16 gigabytes of RAM and a 512 gig SSD, or up to $800 for the 64 gigabyte RAM model and 1 terabyte of storage. The A730M GPU has 24 Xe cores, so that puts it 4 short of an A750 proper. The frequencies are of course different because of the power difference, but it should be able to handle light gaming pretty well. As a note, the A730M version that Minisforum opted for has 6 gigabytes of memory rather than the usual 12. The second piece of Minisforum news to talk about is an unnamed 6-liter ITX PC the company teased on its X page. It's X page. It's a letter. It's set up to have one of 2 mini ITX motherboards with embedded CPUs. one Intel 13th Gen, and one AMD Zen 4. Fundamentally, the boards are a lot like Orion, the motherboard we covered in another video previously, just without the sort of made in an alley out of salvaged parts aesthetic and vibe. They've got two M.2 slots, they take SODIMMs, and they have a full-length PCIe slot. Now, a discrete GPU would go on top of the case. You can barely see it in the renders of the chassis, but flush with the top wood panel is a PCIe by 16 slot, and at the rear is another slot for the bottom of the PCIe bracket to socket into. There's no obvious method of securing the graphics card here, but this is still in development, so there's bound to be some solution in the final product. This is very unique, so we're actually really interested to see how it turns out. So this is why the smaller stuff, and this is why we're getting into mini ITX reviews again as well. It requires really clever solutions to pack stuff in that small and relatively powerful. So Minisforum hasn't yet given a price or release date for this particular system yet. But we're going to keep an eye on it, so we'll let you know when they do. Up next is the gigantic mystery NVIDIA cooler story that won't die for some reason. There's a new development to the story. This one's just kind of fun to follow along with. It doesn't really seem like a thing that's going to exist. We'll see, but it seems more like an abandoned product. Either way, if it comes out, awesome, we'll test it. And if it doesn't, we get the fun of talking about it. So this time, leaker Hayaka, who posted some of the images originally, posted another set of images to the Goofish marketplace, which appears to be effectively like an auction site in eBay in China. It has a listing price of 666,666 yuan. As we went over before, this design is entirely flow-through due to the 90-degree rotated PCB. So if it had only two fans, the middle of a large cooler would be a flow dead zone. Machine translation of the listing seems to imply that there are 22 heat pipes terminating into a vapor chamber, but we don't count that many here, and some of them could be both ends of one pipe bent. Regardless, those heat pipes and the huge amount of surface area would make this capable of dissipating monstrous heat loads. There's also a section of deco fins to cover the central area where the third fan is. The other really interesting thing is the set of power wires that reroute the 12-volt high power or 12-volt 2x6 connection down to where the PCB would be. It's composed of two flat, large wires that wrap around the cooler through a groove in the outer frame and terminate as large copper tabs with screw holes through the middle for securing them to the PCB. Anyone who's been around DC power on equipment or in data centers recognizes this type of solution where they're basically going for fewer, larger wires to deal with the current load. Now, in case you don't know, the base design for 12-volt high power is an off-the-shelf Molex standard part called microfit. And then PCIe 6-pin or 8-pin standard connectors are often called and are mini-fit. But there's another one. Megafit. Maybe that's the solution. The high level of complexity on display here would make this a very expensive cooler to produce, which could be a huge contributor to NVIDIA maybe scrapping this design if that's what happened. Remember, this thing has never officially been commented on by NVIDIA, so its current status or what it is or was is all speculation. Even if it's the most elaborate fake in the world, kudos to the people faking it, because it still looks like a real cooling solution. At this point, we're pretty comfortable with saying most of the worthwhile information has been extracted from this particular rumor, so we don't plan on covering it again unless NVIDIA announces it formally as a real product, or if we get some official commentary from NVIDIA. As a quick tack on to the last story, while we were writing that one, we saw another listing for an alleged Titan A GPU. It shows some extremely poor quality photos of what basically looks like a 4090 with two 12-volt high power connectors and the words Titan A on the shroud. There are also several alleged screenshots from Ada64 and a specs page that show it having 17,920 CUDA cores and 48 gigabytes of memory for a TDP of 666 watts. All of this would be incredibly easy to fake, especially if you're using low resolution images. Screenshots, very easy to fake, as the overclocking community knows from the sort of history of occasional faked validation images, and this one's just too early to call. We did look at it. We considered trying to buy it, but the likelihood of it just being a total scam is far too high, and so we'll just wait and see if anything happens here. ASRock is launching 3 new motherboards with white PCBs. They are interesting because one of them is AM4. So they're the B550M Pro SE, the B760M HDV M.2, and the H610M-HDV/M.2 plus D5. The Intel boards won't support overclocking capabilities because chipset limitations, although they do support DDR5 memory tuning. That was relatively new. So ASRock lists support for up to DDR5 7200. That's with a number of kits on the QVL, and beneficial to this is the 2-DIMM setup. Having the extra 2 unterminated slots, like most boards have, can hurt stability at high speeds. We've mentioned it before. White-themed builds have been gaining a lot of popularity over the past couple years, but they've mostly been relegated to medium to very high-end products. The $700 Asus Z790 Apex comes to mind as an example. We don't know what the pricing is for these yet, but judging by the mid-range chipset, the lack of excessive covers or quote-unquote armor, these new white options from ASRock look low to mid-range. Now, alternate colorways do add cost for PCBs, and we're kind of surprised that it took this long to get to a decent-looking new colorway for the lower-end markets or mid-range markets. It's taken a while, although to be fair, it took a while for all the boards to incorporate black as the PCB coloring as well, because if you remember, originally you got a lot of brown, beige, and of course the classic green for PCBs. Also, quick side note, Noctua should partner with a motherboard vendor and bring back the brown PCB. I am 100% positive there are a lot of Noctua enthusiasts who would definitely buy it. Like, genuinely. Up next, PCI-SIG, the standards organization for the PCI and PCIe protocols, wants optical PCIe. This would be a massive change because your transmission for optical, the potential throughput, is effectively limitless, at least by our current standards today. So PCI-SIG is forming a new work group to explore options for bringing PCI signaling to optical media, and this would allow for easier scaling into higher performance levels as the devices continue to increase their throughput. So currently, the future 128 gigatransfer per second data rate of 7.0, not sure if that's fully ratified yet, but of the 7.0 spec document, would be exceeded even by optical. Now, it's unclear at this time whether the optical work group will be embedding optical communication within PCBs, or if this is aimed, for example, primarily at communicating between a host device and an expansion slot in a data center somewhere. As background, when it comes to transmitting data over fiber optics, the sky is really the limit. A multinational team of researchers recently set the world record, yes, this is something that people compete for data transmission. And they hit 1.7 petabytes per second over a 63.5 kilometer long 19-core fiber. So yes, 1.7 petabits per second. And speaking in theoreticals, that's fast enough to download the entirety of the Internet Archive's 139 petabytes in about 11 minutes. Now, naturally, you would need all kinds of other things in place, infrastructure for that to be possible, but it's about the theoreticals. Next up, Lenovo is joining the booming handheld market. There's really not much to this story, so we're not gonna try and stretch it out. It's basically a leak or a rumor of the Lenovo Go. All we know is that they're making a handheld device, probably, and that's it. This might be a revision or a revival of the previous Lenovo Android handheld project that appears to have been scrapped. Maybe they're moving a direction to compete more with the Ally and the Steam Deck instead, which would be great. Either way, the handheld gaming market has really been blowing up lately. It's awesome to see because there's a lot that can be done in this market. You can completely change the chassis design between the different devices and have actual meaningful change where not only does, from a design viewpoint, does the company have to tackle engineering challenges like thermal in a small enclosure, but they also have to keep it ergonomic and actually usable, because it's you're holding the device that has the thermal and the power problem. So really cool stuff. We're excited to work on more of these. And apparently Lenovo will be joining the arena. So that's it for this hardware news. Thanks for watching as always. Subscribe for more. Go to store.gamersnexus.net to help us out directly, and patreon.com/gamersnexus if you'd like to contribute a couple dollars a month to our testing efforts. Thank you for watching. We'll see you all next time.